Ladies and gentlemen, faculty, staff, alumni, and colleagues, Assalamu alaikum and greetings from Pakistan. Today we're here for our second session of series Conversations with the Experts. It's indeed an honor to have Dr. Arun Bansal with us. Dr. Bansal is a professor, Pediatric Critical Care Unit, Advanced Pediatric Center of Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research, Chandigarh, India. And not only that, he served on many elite societies that include being the General Secretary on the Pediatric Intensive Care Chapter. He's an executive board member of the Indian Academy of Pediatrics and a member scientific review committee of INSPIRE and an executive board member of PediStars. We know that this COVID has impacted each one of us. So I think whatever we could learn from Dr. Bansal's experience with regards to preparedness and management in a resource limited setting is going to be a useful session for today. So over to Dr. Bansal and let's hear it out from him. And he'll share his experiences. And Dr. Bansal, over to you.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Sidra, for inviting. It's indeed a privilege to be here with all of you. So I am here at Chandigarh in India. Maybe people in Pakistan will know where Chandigarh is. So let me share my slides. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, I hope I'm visible. So today I'll be speaking for the next around 45 minutes on this preparedness and management of COVID in our kind of setting, because in this part of the country, we all work in almost similar kind of resources and problems. So I'll be covering the brief epidemiology, and then I'll discuss why the disease in children is milder, and then the clinical features, the severity of illness, then how do we need to prepare ourselves in our kind of setting. And as ICU preparedness is very important, we will discuss about the management of ICU and some part of the treatment and investigations in that. Okay. So this all issues started somewhere in the early part of this year, in the 7th January, when WHO named the virus 2019 as the novel coronavirus. And on 11th February, it named it as the illnesses associated with it as called as COVID-19. But later on, in somewhere in Feb later and March, the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses renamed this disease as Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, that is SARS-CoV-2. But in pediatrics, we were not having many cases initially, and there was not much of data coming. But we have seen from the CDC data that only around less than 2% of the children less than 2% of the whole population affected is of pediatric age group, that's less than 18 years. And of these, only 20% were hospitalized, compared to almost 1/3 to more than 1/3 of the adults who were hospitalized, and then many needed ICU care. Very few among these of pediatric patients who are hospitalized need ICU care, but definitely those who need it, they also form a big chunk. If we take the volume wise, they are a big number, especially in Southeast Asia. What's been the worldwide and the reported incidence of pediatric, like the Chinese data included patients of pediatric age group less than 10 years. They found that less than 1% were of the children were infected from the total infected population. Korean had 6.3, Italian showed 1.2. So somewhere it varied between less than 1 to around 6.3%. In our institute, we have seen almost 11 to 12% of the positive patients which had come are of pediatric age group. But maybe ours is like a tertiary referral center, so this is a very skewed data. The population data may be whatever is may be seen worldwide. But we all know now by this time that the disease is very mild in children, and there have been a lot of theories going on that why it is a milder disease. There are a couple of theories, or maybe more than that, which are saying that because this virus attacks the attaches to the ACE2 receptors, that the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptors, which are the alveolar type 2 they're expressed by alveolar type 2 cells, and their number or their presence is less in children's lungs. So they maybe that is one of the reasons. Other reason could be because the comorbidities like cardiovascular disease and diabetes mellitus, they are the risk factors for COVID, and over and above they have some endothelial damage due to age-wise or whatever, due to other comorbidities. So, and COVID attaches to the endothelium and damages it there and causes significant vascular endothelial injuries. So in healthy children, the endothelial is practically intact, so there is no predisposing damage. So that could be one of the other reasons. Other theories which have come up is about the innate immunity, because that's the first line of defense against this virus. And in pediatric patients or the children, this innate immunity is well developed and they are also well vaccinated. So these are the various mechanisms which they have seen, which works because of the less severity of the illness. The ACE2 receptors, which could be because of the age related. Then we have the antibody dependent enhancement because of this, and then the immunity part. And then some virus interactions, they may say, may also play a role in the less severe disease in the pediatric age group. But nevertheless, they still form a very important part of the population in the spread and in the severity, because asymptomatic forms are also very predominant in pediatric patients, and they can lead to a dangerous situation in the community by human-to-human transmission and also accelerating the pandemic. In one of the Chinese multicentric study, it has been shown that children less than 3 years account for majority of the asymptomatic cohort, and these children are very difficult to control and to isolate or quarantine or to have some social distancing. So they are at a greater risk of spreading it to the vulnerable population in the family or in the community. So that's why pediatric patients are also very important, even when asymptomatic. So this would be the usual flow of the disease. Like if we go, this is the days on the x-axis and the severity of illness in the y-axis. So initially we have the inflammatory response, which starts peaking by end of week 2. We have then by the end of week 2, and then subsequently the oxygen saturation starts falling. The viremia load increases initially, and then gradually it starts coming down. So it could be initially the incubation period, the symptomatic, and then the early pulmonary phase and the late pulmonary phase. That's the, if we divide it into the pathogenesis, the various stages. So it's usually the behavior is like that. But this is extrapolated from the adult population. So that's how it behaves. How long this virus keeps on shedding is very important, because it has been seen that in children, the virus sheds more for more longer duration than in the adult population. This is again one of the studies in which 110 children were there, which were approximately median age of 6 years. They found that the median period of viral shedding was 15 days. And this shedding was shorter in asymptomatic patients, but was higher in symptomatic patients. Was for approximately 17 days. And various factors associated with prolonged duration of viral shedding in children were basically symptomatic patients. They had a longer duration of shedding of virus versus the asymptomatic one. If they were febrile, again, they had found to have the viral load for longer duration. If they developed pneumonia, and if they had a low lymphocyte count. So all these factors were significant were found to be significant in the delayed shedding of the virus. And the virus shed has been found as long as up to 70 days in the fecal matter. In the and also, it's been also shown that it's more the duration lasts for longer period than the adult population. Now, coming to the classification, it can be mild asymptomatic infection to moderate or ordinary symptomatic to severe and to critical cases, and they present with high mortality. This is what the full loop is, and it can vary. The child can have a full course, or they can just have a very mild asymptomatic course and may go undetected. In one of these meta-analyses involving 10 studies of approximately 3,000 pediatric patients, they studied about the clinical presentation and all the other factors that how the pediatric patients behave with this disease. They found that there were approximately 444 children had, or 95 children out of 444 had comorbidities. The rest, approximately 2,500 patients, there was no mention in those studies whether they had any comorbidities or not. So out of the available data of 95 patients with comorbidities, asthma was most common, with then cardiovascular disease and immunodeficiencies. And only 5 deaths have been reported in almost all these patients till now. And if we see what are the common presentation, fever was the commonest presentation, followed by cough. Then we can also see the other respiratory distress, URI and sore throat as the presentation, and asymptomatics were also there in this cohort. And not only the respiratory, they also present with the gastrointestinal or the abdominal symptoms and the neurological symptoms. So you can see there were patients who had presented with vomiting or abdominal pain or diarrhea as the predominant symptom, or as headache, fatigue, or myalgia. So what this shows is that they can have variable presentation, and the respiratory symptoms may not be always there. This was one of the meta-analyses done by the colleagues from our center and from All India Institute Delhi, published in Indian Pediatrics this month. They included, this meta-analysis included 27 studies, of which majority were from China, and then few from Italy, Korea, US, and Spain, including approximately 5,000 children. They have shown that the fever was present in approximately 50% of the patients, cough in 45%, coryza in 20%. And then again, similar to what the other meta-analysis had shown, that they also present with gastrointestinal symptom and some neurological symptoms. And in the laboratory finding in this analysis, we found that leukopenia and was there, one of the most common finding. And then leukocytosis was also there, lymphopenia. Then they have the elevated liver enzymes. Elevated CRP was present only in 16% and procal in only in 1/4 of the patients. So these may not be very good markers to tell you whether the child is having any inflammation going on or not. The meta-analysis published, which I discussed earlier, or approximately 3,000 patients, they have also shown that the WBC count was almost normal, but lymphopenia was seen in very few of the patients, and lymphocytes also in very few. Procal was high in few of the studies, that's 0.53, and these were the studies in which procal was high. Rest in it was normal. The severity of illness, usually they present with mild illness, and moderate illness was seen in 56%, and very few percent of children were severely ill or critically sick requiring ICU admissions. Rest mild were managed at home or were required very minimal hospital care. If we see that how many children require hospitalization and kind of care, we see that hospitalization is required in quite a significant number of patients out of this. And out of that, if we see PICU care was needed in less number of patients in whatever data is available till date with us. And very few required any oxygen support or any respiratory support, and all the more very few required invasive ventilation, intubation and invasive ventilation. So in the, how many percent of children need ICU? Approximately in the Chinese study, they have seen that 6%, and the Spanish people have shown us that 10% of the children needed ICU. And out of these, approximately half develop pneumonia, so which may end up on some kind of respiratory support. And it has also been shown that pneumonia is one of the other important factor in the severity and outcome. Coming to now, as we know that we also see children who land up in ICU, and they, if we see it percentage wise, they might look a very less number. But if the, as we know, the numbers are increasing, the disease is spreading in both India, Pakistan, and everywhere in the Southeast Asia. So we might also get loaded with the numbers in ICU. So we have to be well prepared. And so the best in our kind of setting is to create the cohort ICUs where all these confirmed cases will be managed. And so the other non-COVID patients and these COVID patients are separate areas, so you don't mix them, so that there is no risk of cross contamination or cross infection. Also, there should be a separate area for the suspected COVID. So they should not mix with those which are non-suspected patients also, especially the SARI patients. They should be separate from the other non-normal patients. As the numbers are increasing, maybe general beds have to be converted to ICU beds and provided with the good infrastructure or the minimal infrastructure to handle this load, which we might expect in near future. What we have done in our hospital and in our emergency ICU and in our pediatrics department, that we have a separate COVID suspected area and the SARI area in which we screen these patients, and then we keep them and we test them till the tests come negative, and then they are shifted to the separate area. And if they are positive, till the results come positive, they are in a separate ward in which the staff is well separate and they are in proper protection. So if they are positive, then they are shifted to the COVID positive area where they are managed separately. And all these patients are managed by our pediatric doctors and nursing team separately. So how do we set up these COVID areas and the isolation rooms? Basically, either you have a general ward in which all these are together if they're positive, but you might need some isolation rooms also. So preferably it should be negative pressure isolation, but they may not be a luxury in our part of the country or in the world. So we might not be having, or they might be very few in number. So then we might use other available single rooms, and we can have a separate air outlet or exhaust. And these rooms should preferably be on the higher floor of the building, so that the vents are, it doesn't mix with the other patients or other rooms. So in a negative pressure room, what are the parameters which are required? Basically, if you have a negative pressure isolation, you need to have at least minus 2.5 to minus 5 of the PSI pressure in that. And number of air exchanges, if it's a ward, then 4 air exchanges per hour. If it's an old ICU, there should be 6 to 12 air exchanges per hour. And or increase the ventilation to 160 ml per person. That's the minimum ventilation which is required in these rooms. So if, like for an example, in a naturally ventilated room, if we see that how much air circulations are happening per hour. So if you have the windows open and the doors open, we have approximately 45 air circulations per hour. And if you have the doors closed but windows open, it decreases by more than half. And if windows are open but doors are closed, it's only 15 air circulations. And if both windows and doors are closed, there is just 3.4 air circulation per hour. So that's how important it is that if you don't have these negative pressure rooms available, maybe you can have some availability facility to have ventilation available, and you can use the exhaust, and then this can be taken care of. So you should have approximately 300 cubic feet per minute of exhaust fan capacity. So how do we calculate this? Basically, it is the volume of the room into air exchanges per hour divided by 60 minutes. So you can calculate it. Basically required is like if you have a room volume is, let's say, around 1900 cubic feet. So you have to divide it. This is the formula. So you need approximately 5 air circulations per hour or air changes per hour. So that is how you calculate what is required in your room. So based on that, you can use the exhaust of the ventilation in your hospital. So this will be this is a brief pictorial, just a small video which will show you that if there are no windows or exhaust present, how much the droplets are present in the air. So if you see, even after 20 minutes in this, the droplets are still circulating. But if the windows or exhaust are open, so within 30 seconds, all these droplets get cleared. So that's how important this air circulation is. So, so we should not be undermining, and this also stresses upon that how much time we are going to have a contact in this room and that room with the patient. So that's a contact time should be minimal. So we should be cohorting all our therapy. So we finish it fast and then we come out. Other important part of this ICU preparedness is the patient and the staff. So all the general patients and the staff care. So all elective non-urgent admissions and surgeries need to be halted. So we do, that can wait, and if they are not urgent. And we need to reallocate the staff, and we have to pool in the staff from other specialties like infectious disease, respiratory medicine, or other units. And then rotation of staff and reserve, keeping backup is very important, and they should be working in shifts. And we should not be exposing all of our team in one shift or in one circulation of our roster. So they should preferably rotate every few days to a week, and they should get adequate rest in between, because these duties can be very stressful, especially if you are working with full PPEs on. And then training of the staff, and including all resident healthcare workers, nurses, and your sanitation workers is very important regarding your infection control, how to don and doff the PPEs, disinfection of surfaces and equipments, and then rational use of PPEs, because we know these are not cheap and they are not very easily available, even in the best of the countries. So we have to use it rationally. So keep a good supply, and of your continuous chain supply should be maintained, and use appropriate PPEs based on indication, like what kind of mask you should be wearing, what kind of gown, and what kind of protection you need based on the contact which you are having. And minimize the need of PPE by bundling your activities. So try to cohort all the activities together, and try to use physical barriers, and try to use telemedicine as much as possible, and restrict the visitors, because otherwise they will also be consuming your lot of PPEs, and especially the masks and the gowns. Any child who presents to a ICU can present with various symptomatology. They can be presenting with respiratory distress, shock, encephalopathy. They can have myocardial dysfunction. They can present with congestive cardiac failure, and they can have significant coagulopathy, acute kidney injury, and also now we are seeing a lot of cases coming up with multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. The respiratory distress can vary from mild to severe, and they can have severe hypoxemia also. If they are mild, usually they should be managed at home, but moderate to severe should be hospitalized. And if they have hypoxemia, you can start them with low flow nasal cannula oxygen or a face mask with reservoir. And mind it, again, these comes in especially that they should be isolated, and they should be either in a separate room where adequate ventilation is available, because otherwise these are all big risk to the healthcare workers. If you have to intubate and ventilate, use rapid sequence intubation as far as possible, and use a cuff endotracheal tube, and try to put in that and inflate the cuff as soon as you have put in the tube in and it's in good position. Preferably use a video laryngoscope, And if not available, then a more senior or a trained personnel should be there to intubate, because we don't want a repeated attempts of intubation in this. We want that the tube should go in the first attempt, and this should minimize the exposure and also minimizing the because this is a significant aerosol generating procedure, so we don't want any kind of problem or increase exposure to the person who is intubating. Use adequate protective equipments like the mask, the face shield, and the suits or the gowns. Because if you are intubating, you need to be in the full gear. This is the closest you can get, and child can cough or we can vomit, and that can be a problem. People have used acrylic boxes, plastic sheets. We in our unit are using these acrylic boxes. They are polycarbonate hoods with spaces to put in our hands inside and put in the laryngoscope. And they have been, initially we found it a bit tough, but then with repeated practice on simulations, through simulations and then through regular practice, our team has got quite used to it. So in spite of all the full barrier protection which we are wearing, we are also using these acrylic boxes for further protection. Ventilate these children in negative pressure room or with exhaust fan, like I told, and then put a hydrophobic viral filters in the expiratory limb. Use inline suction. That is what we are doing in our ICU. In all these children, we are having inline suction, and that is being done, and we don't use open suction. And extubation again is a very significant aerosol generating procedure. So again, it has to be done with proper precaution. People have used again these with plastic sheets or done this extubation in acrylic boxes or plastic sheets, and then attach them on the face mask or nasal cannula oxygen to wean them off. Another important thing I want to highlight here is that if you have to take, when the child is being ventilated or even non-ventilated on your other mode of respiratory support, you need to take a blood gas. So try to limit it. We are having a portable blood gas machine with us. We use it there. Bedside blood gas monitoring is being done so that it limits the exposure with minimal sampling. You can do it at the bedside. But if you have to send it to your main lab for the blood gas, then do it under proper precaution and send it there with proper labeling and everything. And this holds true for the other sampling also when you're doing it at the bedside. Other important point in the resource limited setting for ventilatory for the respiratory support are the non-invasive means of ventilation like bubble CPAP or NIPPV or indigenous CPAPs, and also high flow nasal cannulas. So sometimes there might be cases, and there are cases in the developed world also, and in now they're coming up in our countries also, that all the ventilators are booked and there are no free ventilators, no other beds available. So to ration our resources, then what do we do? So people have used HFNC, especially the Spanish group. They have used non-invasive ventilation very successfully in these patients, provided they have taken all the precautions for the healthcare workers. So recommendations are there, and the guidelines are, as even the SCCM surviving sepsis guidelines are there, which are saying that this can be used in this pandemic, keeping the limitations in mind. This was one of the, again, a meta-analysis which came up in these, the Canadian group did it, published in Canadian Journal of Anesthesia just recently, of the high flow nasal cannula for acute hypoxemic respiratory failure in COVID-19 patients. And they have seen that the escalation of therapy in patients who were on HFNC was significantly less, and they compared it with the conventional oxygen therapy. So patients who were on conventional oxygen versus this, the escalation of therapy was needed in significantly lesser number of patients, and also need for invasive ventilation was quite significantly less compared to others. But they also said, and it's also very prudent to mention here, that we need to have adequate room ventilation. We have to limit the healthcare worker exposure to the patient and to the viral load. The healthcare worker need to have a good fit respirator and a proper PPE wearing when he's going near the patient, and preferably a surgical face mask on patient receiving the HFNCs. So this is very important. And if a child develops shock, this is basically almost even the guidelines for COVID patients are similar to what is surviving sepsis guidelines for the pediatric septic shock, which came up recently. If the PICU facility is available, give a fluid bolus up to 40 to 60 mL per kilo. And if PICU facility is not available and child is not in hypotension, keep him on maintenance fluid. But if he is hypotensive, give less fluid bolus, that's 10 to 20 ml, but not more than 40. If PICU facility was available, you can go up to 60 mL per kilo. And you have to, what do we target or monitor? Target your MAP of the systolic blood pressure, preferably the MAP, but in settings where you cannot monitor MAP, just target the systolic blood pressure. If facilities are available, use non-invasive cardiac output parameters. They are very important. For fluid boluses, use crystalloids. That's the only fluid recommended. And epinephrine or norepinephrine are the drug of choice, first line of drug of choice for as an inotropes. And you can use even the peripheral route if the central line route is not immediately available. Refractory shock, if it develops, use glucocorticoids, and also monitor lactate for your progression of therapy. Anticoagulation, because in this disease we have seen that it causes lot of thrombosis. Clotting is seen, especially in adult patients. It has been seen it's a very significant problem, and in fact they are starting it very early. It has not been seen very commonly in the pediatric patients. So all those patients who are at low risk of venous thromboembolism, we can start at low dose of subcutaneous enoxaparin, and if available, give anti-10 effector. Patients who are at high risk, give a higher dose of enoxaparin and anti-10 effector. If your multi-organ failure develops with thrombocytopenia, you can use plasma exchange. And convalescent plasma role is still experimental and research. There are no guidelines or data available about its safety in the pediatric age groups, and no recommendations are there at present. We in our center are using this convalescent plasma therapy as a trial in adult patients. We haven't used it till now in any pediatric patients at present. We are now seeing a lot of multi-system inflammatory syndrome. The CDC has given its definition that any patient who is less than 20 years present with fever and altered inflammatory markers, that is increased CRP, ESR, fibrinogen, procal, D-dimer, and all these other interleukins and other markers, and with illness which is quite severe requiring hospitalization with 2 or more organs involved, like respiratory, neurological, abdominal, hepatic, gastric, so all the renal. So 2 or more of these organs involved with these findings, and with no other possible diagnosis, like there is no bacterial sepsis, there is no other clear-cut diagnosis you have made. And also there should be a recent or current SARS infections, which should be a proven SARS COVID infection with positive RT-PCR or serology test. So if all these criteria are met, we label this as multi-system inflammatory syndrome. So how do we manage this? Give full hemodynamic support like any other child. Do a chest X-ray, CT scan, ECG, and echocardiography to measure all the parameters. Lab markers of inflammation as per the definition, and start on broad spectrum antibiotics. There's no specific treatment actually. People have tried glucocorticoid, anticoagulation, used IVIG, and there are trials going on with anakinra also. So there are various drugs are available, and people have labeled it as MIS-C or Kawasaki disease or many hypercytokine storm and many other things. Another interesting, important parameter in this is about the radiology, that is the CT scan of the chest. The gold standard still remains the RT-PCR, but studies have shown that CT scan of the chest may have a higher sensitivity and prognostic value than the PCR. in one of these Japanese study in which they had included almost, I think they were around 30 25 or 30 children, I think. They found that consolidation and ground glass opacities being the commonest finding in their cohort. So they did not find what we see commonly in the ground glass opacities are the most common and very common finding in adults. So it was different from what the adult population is seeing. This was about the multicentric data of this 10 observational studies in which they have seen that chest X-ray was abnormal in almost half and or in all of these patients, and CT scan was abnormal in one of these study in almost all the 4 patients. But the study by Feng et al. Showed 9 patients out of 15, and this Liu et al. From China had shown 111 CT scans were available which were abnormal. But we about the baseline data, the denominator, we don't know that out of how many they were abnormal. So the CT scan do have some role in this in the diagnosis. This is the largest data on the till now on the availability of CT scan in the pediatric patients. Is systemic review on published in Pediatric Radiology. Recently, of the 22, they included 22 articles, and in these 421 children underwent CT scan in the pediatric age group. So they had shown that almost 34% had a normal CT, and abnormalities were more common in lower lobes, and they were predominantly unilateral as compared to adults in which it is bilateral, and most common was the ground glass opacification, that is 62% had ground glass opacities. There was no lymphadenopathy and pleural effusion, which was seen in only in 3 cases. And they did also a follow-up CT scan, which was as low as after 3 days or to 15 days. And they found that improvement was seen in 29 CTs out of 100, which was done. And out of, if they were normal, they remained normal in 25, but only 9% it progressed to worse disease. What are the various drugs available? We have various antivirals which have been tried. Various armamentarium of drugs have been tried in these patients. But unfortunately, we don't know what is the drug in this, and there are no guidelines and no specifics available with us. People are using the drugs as per their own experience and as per the data is evolving. We have evolved from knowing nothing to also at present, I would say still we don't know much, even though we have got a lot of knowledge about the pathogenesis of the disease. But on the therapy front, we are still very clueless that which drug work in this. People have used various antivirals like remdesivir, lopinavir, and ritonavir combinations. Immune therapies have been tried like interferons and convalescent plasmas. Anti-inflammatories, like people have tried glucocorticoids and IL-6 inhibitors, and various other drugs have been tried, IVIGs and many other drugs have been tried. This again was one of the meta-analyses in which they have seen what people have used. People have used commonly the most common used is the lopinavir-ritonavir combination. This is the most common drug used in this, and interferon alpha is another. People have used also oseltamivir quite often, and along with it, IVIG, steroid, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin have also been used. And as a add-on, antibiotics, broad spectrum antibiotics have been used, maybe with the secondary infection or for the primary illness, we don't know. This is basically I thought I will discuss in one slide about the role of dexamethasone. It has got us now a big study and a very remarkable with remarkable results. I will not say a remarkable study, but with remarkable or amazing results has come up with this recovery trial, which came just 2-3 weeks back. They found a significant improvement in the mortality in the dexamethasone group versus the usual care, and in all the patients. They also find significant difference in patients who were on oxygen, the mortality benefit in the dexamethasone arm, And they also found very significant difference in the dexamethasone arm in the patients who were on invasive ventilation. And also they have a good number of patients, like 1,000 patients on invasive ventilation, approximately 4,000 patients on oxygen. And if we take all the patients, there were approximately 6,400 patients. So they have seen the significant amount of benefit in the dexamethasone arm. But this study has a lot of limitation, and people have come out with, authors should be complimented that they have, in a short span of time, they had done such a big study, and they have done this trial, but there have been various limitations which people have come out with in this study, like the investigators did not explore the optimal type of corticosteroid, nor the timing and the dose, because timing, as we have seen the pathogenesis in our first few slides, is very important when the inflammatory cascade setting. What is the dose and which is the appropriate dose of dexamethasone, and duration of this drug is very important. So this information is not available. Moreover, this paper is just come out in preprint, and the results came out only in the press. And this has neither been peer reviewed and has not been published properly. And so even in the when it has come as a preprint, it is mentioned there that it's not peer reviewed and not published. So these as a guideline should not be taken as a guidelines. And other thing for us as pediatricians, all the patients in this group were adults, and they were mainly around above 40, 50-year-old. So we don't know how this will extrapolate into the in our group of population. So if we have to summarize the flow and how do we go in this, we have seen that the viral replicates initially, the viral load increases in the end of the first week, and then it gradually starts weaning. The body starts developing a fighting against it and start developing the innate immunity against it. And if it progresses further and it's not able to balance itself, then the immune dysregulation occur, and then we can have the significant cytokine storm by the end of second week of the after the second week. So the X-ray changes or the CT changes may start worsening over as the disease progresses, and the symptoms also progress, like hypoxia or breathlessness, and these worsen as the disease progresses over a period of time. So we have to basically the therapy, the crux of the management lies in defining or identifying that when do this start, the child start developing breathlessness or hypoxia. We should not wait for the child to become hypoxic. That is what we have in our experience, I would say, or in my experience, or whatever I had seen and learned from others, and whatever we have seen, is that don't wait for the child to become hypoxic. You have to start your treatment before that. And the trick lies in deciding that breakpoint, that now when you have to admit and start your anti-inflammatory and antiviral therapy. So to summarize, I would say that children are less susceptible, and they can have a mild to moderate illness, but that does not rule out that they will not have severe illness or there will not be deaths in this group of patients. They might be low in percentage, but as a number wise, we might still be loaded and we might get overwhelmed. And they might not have fever or cough as a predominating symptom, as fever and cough is present only in 50% of the patients. And they asymptomatic patients, children can accelerate our human to human transmission. So preparedness is the key. For hot your ICUs, take good precaution with the aerosol generating procedures. Wear adequate personal protective equipment. You cannot, I cannot it has to be under stress it. And there is a good role of non-invasive ventilation and HFNC if used appropriately, but try to, if the child is worsening, don't delay it. That's the point again in NIV, that don't delay it and intubate early, and because you may not get chance later on. So intubate early and ventilate your children if they are deteriorating. and manage appropriately shock. Don't overload your patient with fluids. And unfortunately, no definite drug is available, but we can try whatever drugs are available. But timing, the most important point here in this group of patients is the timing. So don't delay your therapy and be more aggressive in this group of patients. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bansal, for a fantastic, exhaustive review on COVID. And I'm sure our audience has learned a lot from your experience. And I think it was a brilliant presentation, especially the summary that you provided at the end. Actually discussed a lot of important points. So I'll give it up to Dr. Naveed now to take any questions that we may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bansal, for such a fascinating talk and a broad overview. We'll move on to the questions. One of the questions which I have is, as you have mentioned, that in some parts of the world, CT scan is more have more efficacy as compared to the RT-PCR. Do you have come across any patients who does have CT scan findings or radiological findings which are going in lines of the COVID-19 and they came out to be negative initially and then later came out to be positive?
See, literature has shown that people, they have been COVID negative, but they have been diagnosed based on the CT scan. Definitely, there are a significant number of data available in it. But in our experience, I haven't seen any yet with that. I have found that COVID negative, but they have turned radiologically to be positive. And I don't think I have come across any of our Indian cohort, because we are collecting our own data also. And we have not, nobody has at least put it in our pool of patients, the data that the COVID test, RT-PCR or serology was negative, but CT scan was positive.
All right. So thank you. We'll move on to our next question. We talk about the phased and tiered plan for an ICU during the pandemic. Can you kindly elaborate that in terms of?
Sorry, I couldn't get it. Can you please repeat it?
We talked about the phased and tiered plan for an ICU during the pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I understand is, yes. So what I understand they want to ask is that how do we phase our resources? Is that what they mean?
Yeah.
I think that, yes. So I would say that in your hospital or in your department, maybe you can allocate one area of the floor, especially for the COVID. And then in that you can have one separate area for COVID suspected and one for the COVID positive. And then divide your staff accordingly. And you can make it like what we are doing here is when a patient comes to our ER, we have a separate screening room for them. And from there, they are separated into these suspected patients and the non-COVID patients. So that if we suspect any of these patients to be of COVID, we put them in a separate room where we have a team available. They are sitting there continuously 24/7. So they screen that and then shift it to the COVID suspect area in the separate building, separate floor. So there they do their COVID test, and which we do both the gene expert and we also do the nasopharyngeal swab for the and these results usually take from as short as 2 hours to sometimes to 6 to 8 hours to come in.
All right.
So till the time that patient stays in the COVID suspect site, so there is a separate team kept for the resident and a nurse. 2 people are there and one a sanitation person. So 3 person are always there in that area and they are on 6 hourly duties. So, and they are in the full PPE kits. So if the patient comes positive, it is shifted to a COVID positive area, which is a separate building, in fact. So we have one full building dedicated to COVID positive, and that's common for the adult and pediatrics. So that's what I meant by cohorting your ICUs for COVID patients. So there, all the adult and pediatric positive patients are kept in that building. And there also we have a separate pediatric team there, one resident and one consultant available, and nurses and one nurse. So they look after their patient in that area, and if they need ICU or any kind of support, they are, and they are hospitalized obviously only if they are moderate to severely ill. Milder patients, we have a separate facility, they are shifted there or they are home quarantined. So, and these staff which we have, they rotate every 6 hours and they stay with, they are on the rota for 7 days. And then we give them 7 days off after that. Where, and then they are also given the option whether they want the hospital facility to be quarantined or they want to quarantine themselves at home. Many of our staff, like if they have any old family members or young kids or any other or very crowded space at home, they take the hospital facility. So we gave them very single rooms in the in our building, and there are good facility available. And we have also booked a adjacent hotel here, so which is exclusively for our healthcare workers. So they are kept there for a week. So that's how we are cohorting. And then in that area in which COVID suspect and COVID positive, equipment wise, we have kept all the separate equipment like the resuscitation trolley, the drug trolley, the monitors. We have kept separate defibrillator, ECG machine, X-ray machine is separately kept in there. We don't mix it. And we have separate ventilators for that area. And even the blood gas machine, I told in the COVID suspect side, we have a handheld machine available, the Abbott one. Which is available, and in the positive side, which is common for adult and pediatric, we have a conventional full-blown ABG lab established there. The person sits there, so he keeps on doing that. So that's what I meant by like you have to have a very planned approach in this. So that way you are bound to have less problems.
Okay. With this, I will move on to the next question. With regard to the transport of these patients, especially to the radiology for CT scan, what approach you look into?
Yes. So the X-ray and ultrasound, we do it on the bedside.
Yeah.
So a separate machine is there. For CT scan, it's basically, we have created a separate corridor. That's for in that building, that's the adult side. A separate corridor is there, and we separate trolleys are there. The same team which is handling it, they go in the full PPE kit, and the separate ambulance is dedicated, and they shift it to that area so that they don't mix it with the general pool of hospital of the patients. And we have multiple machines. We are fortunate to have many machines, so one machine is there dedicated for that. So we don't mix that. Yes.
Right. Sidra, do you have some more questions?
Yes, Dr. Naveed, thank you. Okay, so we have an interesting question, Dr. Bansal, with regards to air exchanges, like you mentioned. I think it was a novel phenomena for each one of us. So a lot of times when you don't have a negative pressure room, we end up irradiating it with the ultraviolet light. So how effective is that used in case of a resource-limited setting if you do not have a negative pressure room? Have you used that as your experience?
No, we have not. But there are studies, and I think there is. I had one of my colleagues had the slides, and he had done that presentation a couple of weeks back, and had shown that they do play some role in radiation in that, and those machines come in and they put it in the center of the room or at the side, and then they irradiate the room. And there is some limited data available on this. But I'm not experienced in that because we have not used it on that front. So I think for us this works very well. If you are having limited space, I think having an ventilation with exhaust fan or a open window is the best way to do it, and put a fan out near the window so that it blows it outside.
Right. And then there's another question with regards to situational awareness. as to, what measures you've taken, or how do you suggest we can actually go about creating situational awareness?
That means within the healthcare worker or in the general
Yes,
public?
yes, amongst the healthcare workers, yes.
Healthcare worker. So it's basically the training. You have to have multiple training sessions with them, with your residents, with your non-intensive care consultants or personal nurses, and your ward attendants and sanitation workers. They are very important people. So what we have done is, when this all these problems started, the pandemic started in March, and we went into lockdown. So we conducted almost multiple sessions in a day, and then we conducted it every day, which went on for weeks together. And they used to come at their own will. And we staggered them because we didn't want them to be together. We did multiple simulation scenarios on doffing and donning. Then we did multiple scenarios on intubation. We did multiple scenarios on transporting a patient. We did multiple simulation scenarios on our SOPs, like we did brief them, and then role of your social media, and we created videos on that, that how to doff and down, how to intubate, how to put a face mask, and how to do various other procedures. So these were done, and we trained our healthcare workers. In that, we also did all these, like our sanitation workers and some of the staff are usually not very good in English. So we did that in our own local languages with them. We created videos in local language with them. And then regarding the diagnosis, this was about the various, about the infrastructure part, and about all the preparedness part. Regarding the diagnosis and how to do it in the ER or in the OPDs, what we have done is that we then again had these sessions with them, that what are the signs and symptoms which you need to pick up, what history to ask. We prepared a checklist for them so that they don't miss anything. So this is what we have done in our, and then we have continuous sessions going on. Then people who are more senior, they are involved in it. We divided them into groups, and so that's what, and each part was, one person was made in charge of it, so that he takes care of everything, and their well-being and preparedness both.
Right, that sounds fantastic. Thank you. And one last question that I have is role of telecritical care. You mentioned the role of telemedicine. So have you already started doing that, or you see that as a promising option?
We have started using telemedicine in our hospital. Yes, we are now doing the teleconsult on an OPD basis every day. So people, the patient do call us, and for their problems, and these are basically, they can be COVID or non-COVID related. Both these patients, they are all our new patients or our old follow patients. So they register with us online or through telephone, and we fix a slot for them every day. And then our team of doctors, residents, and consultants sit there and take up their queries, and we record them and then put it in the case sheet. And that is what all conversation has happened and what all prescription or advice has been given. It is then recorded on the case sheet, and it is kept in the file, their old file or on the new file, whichever is made. So definitely it has a big role. So teleconsultation for the patients, we have started. Then teleconsultation for training, obviously we have, like I told earlier, for the healthcare worker, we have been doing it. Even in our management of patients who are in COVID suspect or COVID positive areas, we have been managing with telemedicine. One thing which we have done is we have put cameras in our COVID positive wards in the ICUs, and then we monitor them in our central station once we are sitting we can in our control room. So we can see their monitor, their vitals, and we can see the patient. because we can't expect our team to be present in PP 6 hours at the bedside. So they are at the nursing station or in a separate room sitting, and then they take the round of the bedside every few hours. But through that monitor camera, they can see what is happening. And then once the resident goes in, he can also talk to the consultant through, they are provided with the smartphones, and they can video chat with the respective consultant. Like a resident who is on duty and you need a consultation regarding dialysis with the nephrologist, or you need a consultation with cardiologist, or you need a consultation with a radiologist for something. So he can consult directly with them through the smartphones, video chat. So they can, that has really helped. We have seen remarkable, and other thing which we have used is in moderate cases in which we have less, we try to limit our exposure to the patients of the healthcare workers, then we don't visit them very frequently. The parents are sitting with them under PP, so we consult with them on phone, on the video call. So they talk to us whenever they feel like. We give them a number and all, we can call them. We give them a number of the resident and the consultant, so they can get in touch with us anytime through video call. So it has played a big role, and it has a future.
All right, thank you very much. Now, another question is from one of the participants is about the role of dexamethasone, about the timing as well as the dose and duration. Are you using it in every patient or in a selected patients?
No, we haven't used it in any till now in pediatric patients.
Okay.
But I would say that from adult experience, that use it early. And if say like a patient is there with a saturation of 98%, now his saturation is 95 or 94. That's the time I think we should be starting it. Don't wait it to go to 92 or 90 or below that. So when the fall is there, the trend is downwards. So that is where people have seen if you start it, the results are better. So I think that's where, and the dose, there is no clear cut which dose works, whether you use the shock dose or the ARDS dose, and the timing, people have used it variably. So I can't comment on it that because there are no clear cut finding on that. Maybe we'll be more wise in another few weeks or months. We are getting so much data on COVID right now.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question was regarding the family-centered care, because patients who are being admitted in ICUs and with the restriction policies for the parents as well as for the relatives for the patients. How do you deal with that in your setup? That is
it's a very interesting question and very difficult to answer, because
I know.
Ethically sending a COVID negative relative or a family member or a parent to a child versus keeping the child away from the family members, it's a very critical balance which one has to make. We try to, if a child is stable and is obviously small and he cannot stay away, we need to keep one member inside, and we try to limit it to one member, and the same member stays inside with under proper precaution. And what we are doing is we have got a consent form signed, consent form available with us, and we explain them that these are the risks of going inside and who can go inside. And what all, if they are having like any comorbidities or any underlying illness, we try to avoid that they should not go inside. And they have to sign it before they go, so that there are no further problems later on that we were not explained about the risk of exposure from the staying with the child. And we provide them proper protection once they are inside. If they are in the ICU, then we don't allow anybody inside.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Sidra, do you have any other questions?
Yes, there's one question with regards to proning in children, Dr. Bansal. What's been your experience with regards to proning of children with COVID and ARDS?
I think with ARDS, definitely yes. And prone has worked. And even in COVID, in adults, it has shown that prone positioning is good and it has worked. And even people have used it in non-ventilated patients also, prone positioning, and only on oxygen in adults in the data what I was reading and what I have heard. So, and you keep them, but it's not easy when to be
Yes, with
prone
kids it becomes
in that.
difficult.
It's all the more difficult, and especially if they are not on ventilator. In ventilator, they are sedated, obviously you can manage. So if you could, I would suggest if they are on ventilator, we should do proning. So that do help.
Right. Dr. Naveed, do you have any questions?
Thanks. I will just check out once more. No, I don't have any others here. So one of the questions which I have, how you have prepared yourself and your hospital, because this pandemic has made and has created a lot of things that people were not prepared before. And this is one of the things that after it, people are looking things differently. So how you guys have prepared for that, and how we can do it at the how one can do it as a part of simulation and things, and also that one can be prepared for the future if that thing happens back again.
Yes. Yes. An interesting question, actually. Actually, we have also evolved, and maybe we are still not perfect where one has to be. We have made a lot of, in the process of learning, we have also made many mistakes. And but one thing which has helped is like being at a Shikha center and handling previous epidemics like swine flu or the SARS and all. We had some idea, but we were not prepared for this kind of pandemic and this kind of mental panic which was there when this all started. So when this all came in March, we were not very prepared to be true in the sense. So it took us a while, but fortunately we had a good team of our pediatric consultants and residents available with us. So they all put up their hand and they came forward and they all helped in the planning and management. We could manage to develop a full floor of approximately 40-50 bed patients as a COVID suspect and a COVID positive area initially. And then we developed SOPs gradually, which now like we have evolved from version 1 to now version 6 over the last 3 to 4 months from our experiences and feedbacks which have come. So what I would say is that learning, communication, and taking feedbacks and noting down and dividing the duties, various duties, and having a good leadership, that has really helped to come up to where we are. And I am very proud to say that we did not have much problems. And we have very successfully managed all our patients till now. And we have had means hardly any problems which we face in our whole 3-4 months of handling of COVID till now. And we had now had quite a number of pediatric patients, and our residents are also helping adult patients also now. So they are also quite experienced with this. So continuous communication, learning, writing down the SOPs, and being there on the floor, and they are really helped.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I do agree with it, because even the best of the best centers were not prepared for it. And in this situation, everyone has passed through a significant experience, and definitely it's all the teamwork and the leadership that plays a role. And that's the key. Sidra, do you have any other questions?
No, I think we almost on time now, Dr. Naveed. And we once again want to thank you, Dr. Bansal, for an excellent overview and for taking out time to talk to us, share your experiences. And I think we thoroughly enjoyed the session. It was a great learning for all of us. And we hope to see you again. So next we meet on Tuesday, and the third session of our conversations will be done by Dr. Martin Neiber, and he'll be talking to us regarding essentials of ventilation in children with COVID. So thank you, good evening, and take care.
And thank you so much. I would like to thank all of you and also the all the listeners from Pakistan and from other parts of the world. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Sidra and Dr. Naveed, for having me. It was really a great pleasure and an honor, and I would love to be part of this again if I get an opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr.